A mother's desperate stand. The courtroom felt colder than it should have, the tension thick in the air. The soft hum of whispered conversations and muffled sobs filled the room, but there was no escaping the silence that seemed to hang over everything. The judge, an elderly man with silver hair and sharp eyes, sat at the elevated bench, his gavel resting on the polished wood before him. He glanced down at the defendant and then back to the paperwork in front of him, his gaze unyielding. His hands, though they appeared steady, gripped the gavel tightly as if ready to use it at any moment. Lydia Jones stood before the court, her shoulders slumped in defeat, her head bowed low. Her long, dark hair hung in loose waves, messy and untamed from the stress she had endured over the past few days. She wore the same clothes she had worn when they arrested her, a simple, faded dress that now seemed to hang awkwardly on her frail frame. Her hands were bound in cuffs, the metal digging into her wrists as she stood motionless, unable to summon the strength to look up at the people around her. The room was eerily quiet. Even the air seemed to hold its breath. Lydia's thoughts were a whirlwind of despair and guilt, drowning out everything else. Her mind replayed the events of that fateful night, the chaos, the crash, the horrible feeling in her chest when she had heard the sirens wail, the lives she had unintentionally shattered. The faces of those 7 people, their lives snuffed out in an instant, haunted her. But that was nothing compared to the face of her daughter, Clara. Clara was seated a few rows behind, next to a man Lydia had once trusted, Enzo. His presence was calm, almost detached, a stark contrast to the storm that raged within Lydia. Clara's small face was pained with confusion and fear. She didn't understand why her mother was being treated like this. She didn't know the whole story, the truth of what happened. But Lydia was certain that she would never be able to explain it to her in a way that made sense. "Do you plead guilty to the charges against you, Miss Jones?" The judge's voice broke through Lydia's internal monologue, cold and authoritative, as though he were reading from a script he had recited countless times. Lydia's heart pounded painfully in her chest as the words settled into her consciousness. The trial, the sentence, it had all been leading to this. Her future, the rest of her life, hung on this single moment. She swallowed hard, trying to gather the courage to speak. But the words felt foreign to her. She wasn't sure if she was capable of speaking them without collapsing under the weight of everything they meant. "Yes," she managed to say, her voice barely audible, cracked with emotion. "I plead guilty to all charges." The room seemed to hold its breath once again. The judge glanced at her, his eyes never leaving her face. His expression remained unchanged, almost clinical in its indifference. "Your charges," the judge continued, his voice firm, "include drunk driving, causing a severe accident that resulted in the deaths of 7 people. You are also charged with fleeing the scene of the crime." Lydia's breath hitched, and her throat tightened as if she had swallowed a boulder. Her hands trembled against the cuffs, but she did nothing to stop it. She couldn't bear to look up. She couldn't bear the weight of all the eyes in the room watching her every move. They were judging her, condemning her, and worse yet, she deserved it. She had made the mistake of driving under the influence that night. The memory of the accident, the violent crash, the blood, the broken glass, it all felt like a nightmare. A nightmare that she couldn't wake up from. I didn't mean for this to happen," Lydia said, her voice cracking as the words spilled out of her. She could feel the sting of shame creeping up her neck, but she had to say it. She had to tell the court that she hadn't intended for anyone to die. I was so lost. I didn't know what I was doing. I never meant to hurt anyone. I swear." But the judge didn't respond. He didn't offer her sympathy or comfort. Instead, he motioned for the court to proceed. A brief moment of silence followed as the room awaited his next words. "You may speak at the time of sentencing, Miss Jones," the judge said, his voice unmoved. "But at present, the evidence is clear, and the law is clear. There is no room for leniency. The judge's words felt like a slap to Lydia's face. She had hoped for some kind of reprieve, some hint of understanding, but it was nowhere to be found. She felt as if her soul were being crushed under the weight of her own guilt, her own failures. The judge shifted in his seat and continued reading from the paperwork in front of him. For the crime of drunk driving, causing the death of 7 individuals, and fleeing the scene, the court sentences the defendant to death. The defendant has the right to appeal this verdict, but for now, this is the court's decision. The words rang out in the room like a thunderclap, and Lydia's heart stopped for a moment. She couldn't breathe. Death. The word seemed to echo endlessly in her mind, drowning out everything else. She had been expecting the worst, but hearing it said aloud in such a final, cold tone, was a different kind of devastation. It felt unreal, like a cruel twist of fate. She had tried to escape the consequences of her actions, but now, they were coming for her. The judge paused, letting the weight of his words settle over the room before turning to the rest of the court. This concludes the preliminary trial. The defendant has the right to appeal, and the court will reconvene for a retrial at a later date to review the case. This concludes the hearing for now. The room was thick with murmurs, but Lydia couldn't hear them. Her vision blurred as she felt herself lose control, her body betraying her as her legs gave way beneath her. She was gripped by a suffocating sense of despair, her entire world crumbling with each passing second. "No," she whispered under her breath. "No, this can't be happening." It wasn't just the death sentence that terrified her. It wasn't just the knowledge that her life was over in a legal sense. It was Clara. Clara, her beautiful daughter, who would be left behind in this world without her. She could already see the pain in Clara's eyes, the fear that was beginning to take root in her heart. Lydia's eyes darted across the courtroom, searching desperately for her daughter. She needed to make sure Clara was okay. But before she could call out, her eyes landed on Enzo, the man who had been her partner in a fleeting moment of weakness. He sat there, a figure of controlled calm in the midst of the chaos. His expression was unreadable, his posture straight and perfect, but his eyes did not soften when they met Lydia's. They were cold, distant, and calculating. Lydia's heart sank. She wanted to scream at him, to ask him why. Why had he let this happen? Why had he told her everything would be fine, only for her to end up in this nightmare? But before she could voice any of her questions, her world collapsed once more. Clara screamed out, her small voice cutting through the air like a knife. "Mom! Please! Don't leave me! You're innocent! I know you didn't do it!" The sound of Clara's voice, so raw, so desperate, shook Lydia to her core. She turned toward her daughter, her body trembling with the effort to keep herself together. But it was no use. Tears flooded her eyes as she called out to Clara, her voice strained with desperation. "Clara! My baby, I love you. I'm sorry. I never wanted this. I never wanted to hurt anyone." But the words were drowned out by the rising uproar in the courtroom. The guards moved swiftly, grabbing Lydia and forcing her away from the scene. The last thing she saw was Clara's face, wide-eyed and tearful, as she was dragged out of the courtroom. A mother's last hope. The courtroom erupted into chaos as Lydia was forcibly removed, her cries echoing off the cold, stone walls. Her body was dragged toward the exit, the hands of the guards gripping her roughly as she struggled against them. Her mind raced, trying to make sense of what had just happened. The finality of the judge's sentence, the crushing weight of it, was almost more than she could bear. It was as if the entire world had stopped, leaving her to drown in an ocean of regret. "Mom, no. You can't do this." Clara's voice pierced the noise, shrill with panic. Lydia's heart twisted painfully at the sound of her daughter's cries. She fought against the grip of the officers, her body racked with a mix of anger and helplessness. But it was futile. The officers, trained to restrain, were unyielding as they moved her down the hallway leading to the holding cells. She was being pulled away from her daughter, the only person left in the world who still believed in her. She could already feel the distance growing between them, like a chasm too wide to cross. "Let me go. Let me go to my daughter," Lydia shouted, her voice breaking as she twisted in the officer's hold. But her words fell on deaf ears. "Quiet down," one of the guards growled, tightening his grip on her arm. "You'll have plenty of time to talk in your cell." Lydia's mind raced back to the courtroom, to the moment when her world had crumbled. Clara's innocent face had filled her vision, and the anguish in her eyes was enough to shatter her heart into 1,000 pieces. But there was something more, something Lydia couldn't shake. Enzo's indifference had cut her like a knife. He hadn't moved when Clara had called out, hadn't shown any sign of concern. He had just sat there, distant, emotionless. Lydia's thoughts tangled together in a knot of fury and confusion. How could he remain so calm? She had known him for years. She had trusted him, believed in him. But now, all that she had thought she knew was crumbling away. What had he really wanted from her? She struggled harder against the officers, the desperation rising in her chest. She needed to talk to Clara, to tell her everything. She needed to make sure her daughter knew the truth. Once they reached the holding cells, the officers shoved Lydia into a small, sterile room. She stumbled inside, her legs shaking, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The door slammed shut behind her with a final, unyielding thud. The stark white walls of the cell seemed to close in on her, and for a moment, she allowed herself to sink to the cold floor, her arms wrapped tightly around her knees. The emptiness in her chest was almost unbearable. She let out a shaky breath, her tears falling freely now. "I never wanted this," she whispered to herself. "I never wanted to hurt anyone." Her thoughts swirled, each one more painful than the last. The judge's words echoed in her mind. The death sentence, she had never imagined it would come to this. She had made a horrible mistake, yes. But she hadn't caused this. Not in the way they said. She had been duped, tricked into taking the blame. The memory of that night, the night of the accident, was clear in her mind. She had been at a party, celebrating what she thought was a new beginning, a new life. She had been drinking, yes. But she hadn't planned to drive home. Enzo had assured her he would drive her. But then, something had gone wrong. She couldn't remember the details, the hours blurred together in a haze, but the next thing she knew, she had been behind the wheel, her hands shaking as she sped down the road. The crash had happened so fast. There had been no time to react, no time to stop. Everything had spun out of control. The sound of metal grinding against metal, the smell of smoke, the shouts and cries of the victims, the blood. She had tried to help. She had tried to stay and do the right thing. But Enzo had insisted they leave the scene, that they couldn't afford to get caught. He had said they would be okay, that they could start over somewhere else. She had been so lost, so broken at that moment, that she had trusted him. And now, here she was. The door to the cell creaked open, breaking the silence. Lydia looked up, her tear-filled eyes narrowing against the bright light that poured into the room. A man in a suit stood in the doorway. He was tall, with broad shoulders and a strong presence. His face was stern, yet there was a hint of compassion in his eyes. "Miss Jones," the man said in a deep voice. "I'm here to talk to you." Lydia didn't speak at first. She had no energy left to respond, no words to offer. The only thing she wanted was to curl up and disappear. But the man stepped inside the cell, closing the door behind him. He sat across from her, his eyes never leaving her face. "I'm David McAllister," he said, introducing himself. "I'm an attorney. I've been assigned to help you." Lydia looked at him, the words barely registering. "An attorney?" Was this some sort of last-ditch attempt to save her? She wanted to speak, to tell him that there was no hope, that nothing could change the fact that the judge had already made his decision. But the words wouldn't come. "You've been sentenced to death," David said gently, reading her expression. "I know it's hard to think right now, but there are ways we can fight this. There's still a chance for you to be heard." Lydia shook her head, the weight of her guilt pressing down on her chest. "It doesn't matter," she whispered, her voice cracking. "It's over. I don't even care about my own life anymore. I just need to make sure my daughter is okay. Clara, she needs me. I didn't do this. I didn't, but no one will believe me. No one listens to me." David watched her for a moment, his face softening with sympathy. "I understand," he said quietly. "But it's not over. You've pleaded guilty, yes. But that doesn't mean the court is right. There's something more to this case. I can see it in your eyes. We need to get the truth out there." Lydia looked up at him, her eyes red-rimmed and swollen from crying. "You don't understand," she said, her voice barely audible. "I'm just a black woman. A single mother. No one cares about the truth. They only see me as a criminal. A monster. And they've already decided my fate." David shook his head. "That's not true. That's exactly what we need to change. You have to fight, for yourself and for Clara. It's not over. Not yet." Lydia's heart fluttered with a flicker of hope, but it was so faint, so fragile, that she wasn't sure if she could hold on to it. Could she really fight this? Could she really prove her innocence? "I'll do whatever it takes," she said softly, her voice filled with the quiet desperation of a mother who would do anything to protect her child. David nodded. "Good. That's what I needed to hear. We're not giving up on you, Miss Jones. Not yet." As he stood to leave, he turned back to her. "Get some rest. Tomorrow, we start building your case. The truth is out there, and we're going to find it." Lydia watched him go, her heart pounding in her chest. For the first time in what felt like forever, she allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, there was hope. The search for truth. Lydia awoke in the holding cell, the thin mattress beneath her offering little comfort. The harsh fluorescent lights above buzzed incessantly, casting a sickly glow across the room. Her eyes felt swollen from crying, her head pounding with the weight of everything that had happened. The reality of her situation had not yet fully sunk in, but the numbness was starting to fade, replaced by a deep sense of determination. There had to be a way out of this. She sat up slowly, rubbing her temples, trying to gather her thoughts. The events of the past few days were a blur, her arrest, the trial, the judge's verdict. But there was one thing that stood out above all else, Clara. Her beautiful daughter. Lydia's heart clenched at the thought of her, sitting there in that courtroom, crying out for her mother, her innocent face twisted with fear and confusion. Clara believed in her. Clara thought she was innocent. And Lydia was determined to prove that she was. The sound of the door opening startled her, pulling her from her thoughts. She looked up to see David McAllister, the attorney who had visited her the day before, stepping inside. His face was solemn, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes, a sense of resolve that Lydia couldn't quite place. "Good morning, Miss Jones," David greeted her as he approached, his voice calm but firm. "I've spoken with some people, and we're going to start working on your case today." Lydia nodded, still processing the reality of having someone who believed in her, on her side. She had heard of public defenders, but she had never imagined that someone would actually fight for her. David pulled a chair out and sat down across from her, placing a thick folder on the small table between them. "I know you've already been through a lot, and I can't promise that this is going to be easy. But I want you to know that we're not giving up. You deserve a chance to be heard." Lydia swallowed, trying to steady her breathing. What can we do? The judge has already sentenced me. I pled guilty. What more is there? David opened the folder, flipping through the papers inside before looking up at her. You pled guilty, yes. But what you said in court, about not meaning to hurt anyone, there's truth in that. We need to find the evidence that supports your claim. We need to show that you weren't just another reckless driver, that something bigger was at play here. Lydia frowned. What do you mean? What bigger thing? David leaned forward slightly, his tone low and serious. I don't believe this was a simple accident. I think someone else might have been involved. Someone who could have influenced your actions that night. Lydia's brow furrowed in confusion. I don't understand. Who could have influenced me? I don't remember much about what happened. I was drinking. I don't even know how I ended up behind the wheel. David nodded, understanding the confusion in her eyes. That's what we're going to find out. We're going to dig into your background, your relationship with Enzo, and everything that happened before the accident. There's something more to this, Lydia. I'm convinced of that. The mention of Enzo's name made Lydia's stomach twist. She had been thinking about him constantly since the trial. His cold demeanor, his refusal to help her, the way he had abandoned her in the most critical moment. The thought of him filled her with a mix of rage and hurt. How could he have done this to her? How could he have let her take the fall for something he had been a part of? But David's words made sense. There had to be something more. Enzo wasn't the man he had seemed to be. There were pieces to this puzzle that Lydia had yet to uncover, and she was determined to find them. She needed to find the truth. How do we start? Lydia asked, her voice steady now, a spark of determination igniting within her. David smiled slightly, a small but encouraging gesture. We start by talking to people. We start by gathering evidence, by looking at everything that happened that night. I've already requested access to the police reports, and I'm going to speak with the officers who were at the scene of the crash. We'll also need to talk to anyone who was with you at that party, anyone who might have seen you before you left. Lydia nodded slowly, the plan starting to take shape in her mind. And Enzo? What about him? David's expression hardened slightly. Enzo will be a key part of this. If there's any chance that he's involved in this, if he manipulated you in any way, we need to know. But be careful. I don't trust him. The mention of Enzo sent a wave of anger through Lydia, but she forced herself to calm down. She couldn't let her emotions cloud her judgment. She needed to focus on the truth. She had to do this for Clara. Okay, Lydia said, her voice filled with quiet resolve. Let's do it. I'll do whatever it takes to clear my name. I won't let them bury me for something I didn't do. David stood up, his expression firm. I'm glad to hear you say that. It's going to be a long road, but I'll be with you every step of the way. You're not alone in this. Later that day, Lydia was escorted to a small meeting room where David had arranged for her to speak with a detective who had been involved in the investigation. The room was sterile, the white walls reflecting the harsh lights overhead. Lydia sat across from the detective, a middle-aged man with graying hair and a stern face. His name was Detective Roberts, and he looked at Lydia as though she were just another criminal in a long line of cases. But there was something in his eyes, something that made Lydia think he might not be as convinced of her guilt as everyone else. I've been briefed on your case, Detective Roberts said, his voice flat. And I have to say, I'm not sure what to make of it. The evidence points to you being at the scene, and your fingerprints were found on the steering wheel. It's hard to argue with that. Lydia felt the familiar sense of helplessness creeping back into her chest. But she pushed it away. She had to stay strong. I know what the evidence says. But I didn't do this. I wasn't thinking clearly that night. Someone, I don't know who, was involved in this. Someone made me do it. The detective raised an eyebrow. Made you do it? That's a pretty bold claim. I don't remember everything, Lydia admitted, her voice shaky. But I remember Enzo telling me to leave. He said it was the only way to save ourselves. He said we'd be fine if we just went somewhere else, that we could start over. He didn't care about the people we hurt. He didn't care about anyone but himself. Detective Roberts leaned forward slightly, his expression thoughtful. You're saying Enzo told you to leave the scene? He didn't try to help? Lydia shook her head, her fists clenched tightly in her lap. No. He just wanted to get away from it. He didn't care who we hurt, only that he didn't want to get caught. The detective paused for a moment, clearly processing her words. Finally, he spoke again. I'm going to look into him. If what you're saying is true, we may have something to work with. Lydia's heart skipped a beat. Maybe, just maybe, there was a way out of this. She couldn't afford to hope too much, but this was the first real lead she had gotten. It was a start. The following days were a whirlwind of interviews, meetings, and research. David and Lydia worked tirelessly to gather evidence and piece together the truth. Detective Roberts had agreed to help, and it soon became clear that there were many questions surrounding the accident that had never been fully addressed. David's investigation into Enzo's background revealed troubling details, his past, his relationships, and his connections to people who might have been involved in shady dealings. It seemed that Enzo had a lot more to hide than Lydia had ever realized. But it wasn't enough. They needed more. And as the investigation continued, Lydia began to feel a shift within herself. The hopelessness that had consumed her in the beginning was slowly being replaced with a sense of purpose. For the first time in months, she felt like she had a chance, a real chance to clear her name and bring the truth to light. It wasn't going to be easy. But Lydia was ready. She had nothing left to lose, and for Clara, she would fight with everything she had. The walls of deceit. Days turned into weeks, and as the investigation into Lydia's case continued, the walls of deceit that had once seemed impenetrable began to show cracks. With David McAllister's persistence, more details about the night of the accident came to light. Each discovery was a small victory, but also a reminder of the cruelty of the forces that had conspired against Lydia. She found herself staring at the cold concrete walls of her cell less often, instead spending her days with David, examining the evidence and discussing their next steps. David had become more than just her attorney, he had become her ally in this fight for redemption. His tenacity was infectious. Where Lydia had once believed her fate was sealed, she now saw a flicker of possibility in David's unyielding commitment to uncover the truth. And yet, despite his efforts, Enzo remained a shadow looming over everything. Enzo had been carefully avoiding the authorities. His ties to influential people, especially those in positions of power, made it difficult to track him down. But David wasn't about to give up. Every lead, every piece of information was a thread that could unravel the tangled web of lies surrounding Lydia's case. Today, we make progress, David said, walking into the holding room with a stack of papers in his hands. I spoke to Detective Roberts again. He's been able to trace some of Enzo's past associates. One of them has agreed to meet with us. Lydia's heart skipped a beat. A lead, finally. She had been hoping for this moment, the moment when things would start moving in her favor. Yet, even as hope began to stir within her, she knew the stakes were high. One wrong step could send everything spiraling back into darkness. Who's the associate? Lydia asked, trying to hide the nervous tremor in her voice. His name is Charlie Novak. He's a former business partner of Enzo's. Word is, they had a falling out a few years ago. Novak's been laying low since, but now he's ready to talk. He might know something important about what happened that night. Lydia nodded, but her mind was already racing. If Novak had information, it could be the breakthrough they needed. What's the plan? We meet him tonight, at a location he's chosen. It's a risk, but I think it's worth taking. This could be the key to proving Enzo's involvement. David's voice was firm, but Lydia could hear the undercurrent of doubt. He, too, understood how fragile their chances were. That evening, David arrived at the holding facility to escort Lydia to the meeting. They were both dressed in plain clothes, trying to blend in, as the meeting was supposed to be discreet. The location was a dilapidated building on the outskirts of town, a place that once housed a factory but had long since fallen into disrepair. The streets around it were empty, the quiet broken only by the occasional passing car. As they approached the building, Lydia's pulse quickened. The sense of danger was palpable. She had never been one to shy away from difficult situations, but the stakes were higher than ever now. If Enzo found out about this meeting before they could confront him, everything would be over. She needed this lead to work. She needed Novak to tell them what he knew. David stopped at the entrance of the building and turned to Lydia. Stay alert. If anything feels off, we leave immediately. Got it? Lydia nodded, her mind racing. Got it. Together, they stepped into the building. The air inside was thick with dust and the faint smell of decay. They moved quietly, their footsteps echoing in the hollow space. The dim light filtered through broken windows, casting eerie shadows across the room. A figure emerged from the darkness, a man with shaggy brown hair and a scruffy beard. He looked disheveled but sharp-eyed, his gaze assessing Lydia and David as they approached. You must be David McAllister, the man said, his voice rough, as though he hadn't spoken in days. And you're the one they're calling the innocent mother. He glanced at Lydia, his eyes scanning her face, as if trying to measure her. Lydia didn't flinch at the words. She had heard worse in her life, and right now, she wasn't concerned with anything except what Novak could tell them. Charlie Novak? David asked, his voice steady but wary. We need information. We need to know what you know about Enzo, and we need to know now. Novak gave a cynical laugh, his eyes flicking to Lydia. Information isn't free. You want my help, you better make it worth my while. David didn't hesitate. We'll make it worth your while, but we need you to understand something, Novak, this isn't a game. If you have anything that can clear Lydia's name, you tell us now. The tension in the room thickened. Lydia took a deep breath and stepped forward. Please, she said, her voice calm but desperate. I have a daughter. She believes I didn't do this. I need to prove that I didn't. Help me. For her. There was a moment of silence, a flicker of something in Novak's eyes as he looked at Lydia. Then, with a resigned sigh, he leaned back against the wall. Fine, he muttered. But you're right about one thing. This isn't a game. You're right to be desperate. I'll tell you what I know, but it's not going to be pretty. Enzo's not who you think he is. Lydia's heart pounded in her chest as Novak's words sank in. She had suspected as much, but hearing it confirmed was another blow. He didn't just use you, Lydia, Novak continued, his voice low. He's been playing people for years. He's involved in things much bigger than you realize. I didn't know the whole story at first, but after everything went down, I started putting pieces together. Enzo didn't just run off after the crash. He set you up. You were his scapegoat. He made sure you'd take the fall. Lydia's mind reeled. What do you mean? How could he? Listen, Novak interrupted, his eyes narrowing, you think he just left you to deal with it? No. He planted the alcohol in your system. He made sure the witnesses saw you stumbling around. And he made sure you were alone when the cops showed up. He didn't want anyone to connect him to the crash. He knew exactly what he was doing. David exchanged a glance with Lydia, his jaw tightening. So Enzo planned this? He made sure Lydia was the one blamed? Exactly, Novak replied. I tried to warn you. I tried to get out of that whole mess before it was too late, but you were already in too deep. Enzo didn't care who got hurt. He only cared about protecting himself. The words hit Lydia like a ton of bricks. Everything was starting to make sense now. The pieces of the puzzle were falling into place, and the truth was finally within reach. Enzo hadn't just abandoned her. He had set her up, using her as a pawn in his game of deceit. The feeling of betrayal that flooded through her was overwhelming. She had trusted him, loved him, believed that he was someone worthy of her. But now she saw the truth of who he really was, a manipulative, self-serving liar. David stood, his face hardening with determination. This changes everything. We're going to take this information and use it. Enzo's going to pay for what he did. Lydia could hardly speak. Her mind was still processing Novak's words, but a sense of clarity was starting to wash over her. This was what she needed, the proof that Enzo was the one who had orchestrated the whole thing. She wasn't alone anymore. She wasn't the criminal. She was a victim, just like the others. Thank you, Lydia said, her voice steady but filled with gratitude. Thank you for telling us the truth. Novak nodded, his face unreadable. Just make sure you take him down. For your sake, and for the sake of all the people he's hurt. As Lydia and David left the building, the weight of the information they had just uncovered settled heavily on her shoulders. But it was a weight she could bear. For the first time since the trial began, Lydia felt like the truth was within her grasp. She had a purpose now, to clear her name and expose the man who had tried to destroy her life. The fight for redemption. The day after their meeting with Charlie Novak, Lydia's heart raced as she sat in the small, sterile office at the courthouse. David McAllister stood beside her, his face set in a mask of focus and determination. He had spent the night working on their strategy, poring over the evidence Novak had given them, and preparing the necessary documents to challenge the court's verdict. Today was a pivotal moment, a turning point. It was the beginning of Lydia's fight for redemption, and the first step toward reclaiming her life. David leaned over the desk, speaking quietly but urgently. We have a long road ahead of us. But Novak's testimony changes everything. We now have proof that Enzo manipulated you and intentionally set you up. We've already reached out to the prosecution, and I'm setting up a meeting with the district attorney. We need to present this evidence as soon as possible. They won't want to look the other way once they understand what really happened. Lydia's hands trembled as she held her head up, trying to focus. Her mind was still processing the weight of Novak's words. Enzo had used her. He had used her to cover his tracks and protect himself while throwing her into the fire. It made her sick. But there was something else, something that hurt even more deeply. Enzo wasn't just a man who had wronged her. He had wronged Clara too. Do you think the district attorney will listen? Lydia asked, her voice a mix of hope and uncertainty. David's eyes softened with understanding. They have to listen, Lydia. This isn't just about you anymore. This is about exposing someone who has used his power and influence to destroy lives. We're not just fighting for your freedom. We're fighting for justice. Lydia nodded, feeling a renewed sense of purpose surge through her. It wasn't just about clearing her name. It was about making sure Enzo could never hurt anyone else the way he had hurt her. She owed it to Clara, to herself, and to everyone who had been affected by Enzo's lies. The meeting with the district attorney was scheduled for later that afternoon. As Lydia and David walked into the sleek, modern office, Lydia felt a sense of déjà vu. She had been in so many courtrooms over the last few weeks, listening to words she never thought would apply to her life: guilty, convicted, sentenced. But today, she was not just an accused criminal. She was a mother fighting for her daughter's future, a woman fighting for her life, and a survivor ready to tell the world the truth. The district attorney, a sharp-eyed woman named Allison Pierce, stood behind her desk as they entered. She looked at Lydia with the practiced coolness of someone who had seen it all, but her eyes softened when they landed on David. She knew he wasn't here for a routine case. David shook her hand, then gestured toward Lydia. "We have new evidence that could exonerate my client. We need to talk." Allison's gaze flickered to Lydia, her expression unreadable. She motioned for them to sit, and the three of them took their places. "I've been briefed on your case, Ms. Jones," she began, looking at Lydia. "But I haven't heard about this new evidence you're referring to." "I'm listening." David pulled out a thick folder and placed it on the desk, opening it to reveal the transcripts from his meetings with Novak. Lydia's breath caught in her throat as David began to explain the damning information they had uncovered, how Enzo had intentionally planted the alcohol at the scene, how he had orchestrated Lydia's role in the accident to cover his own tracks. Allison's eyes widened as she flipped through the pages, processing the details. "This is serious. If this is true, it changes everything." Lydia sat up straighter, leaning forward slightly. "I'm telling you the truth. Enzo lied. He set me up. I didn't want to hurt anyone. I didn't even know what was happening. But he manipulated me, made me think that fleeing the scene was the only way to save myself." Allison glanced at David, her brow furrowed. "This is going to be a tough case to crack. You're talking about a man who's well-connected, who's likely covered his tracks in ways that go beyond the surface." David nodded, his voice steady. "I understand the challenges, but we have to try. Lydia deserves the truth to be known. And the people who were hurt deserve justice. I'm not backing down." Allison's gaze lingered on Lydia, her expression softening as she saw the genuine anguish in the woman's eyes. It was the same look she had seen in the eyes of countless other victims, people who had been wronged by the system, people who had been manipulated into believing lies. But this time, she wasn't so sure that the lie had won. "I'll have my team look into this," Allison said finally, her tone no longer as detached. "We can't take this to court without further investigation, but we will follow up with the leads you've provided. If Novak's testimony holds, we'll start looking into Enzo's connections and his actions that night. We owe it to you, and to the victims, to get this right." Lydia exhaled slowly, the weight of the conversation settling heavily on her chest. But for the first time in weeks, she felt like the tide might be turning in her favor. She wasn't just the accused anymore. She was a woman on a mission, a woman who had nothing left to lose and everything to fight for. "I just want to clear my name," Lydia said quietly, her voice trembling with emotion. "I want Clara to know that I didn't do this. I want her to know that I fought for her, for us." The following days were filled with a whirlwind of activity. Allison Pierce and her team began to gather more evidence, combing through Enzo's financial records and his personal connections. Detective Roberts continued to look into Enzo's past, uncovering more and more details about his shady dealings and the web of lies he had woven to cover up his criminal actions. It became increasingly clear that Enzo had spent years using people to get ahead, manipulating them, lying to them, and leaving them behind when they were no longer useful to him. But even as the pieces of the puzzle came together, Lydia couldn't shake the nagging feeling in the pit of her stomach. She knew that Enzo would stop at nothing to protect himself. He had already proven how far he was willing to go to keep his secrets. But this time, he wasn't going to get away with it. Lydia spent hours with David, reviewing the evidence and preparing for what would come next. It was clear that they needed to take their fight to court. They needed to present their case in front of a judge, to show the world that Lydia had been wronged. But it wasn't going to be easy. The legal system was slow, and Enzo's resources were vast. But Lydia had something that Enzo didn't. She had the truth, and she had the will to fight for it. It was on a cold Tuesday afternoon that David received a phone call that would change everything. He walked into Lydia's cell, his face grim but determined. "We've got him," he said, his voice low. Lydia's heart raced. What do you mean? Who? Enzo, David replied. We've got enough evidence now to charge him. He's been arrested, and they're preparing to take him to trial. This is it, Lydia. The truth is finally coming to light. Lydia's chest tightened, and tears welled in her eyes. The feeling of vindication, of finally having the chance to clear her name, was almost overwhelming. For Clara, for herself, for the people who had been affected by Enzo's lies, Lydia was ready to face whatever came next. The fight wasn't over yet. But the battle for her freedom was finally taking shape. The walls of deceit were crumbling, and Enzo's empire of lies was starting to fall apart. The final confrontation. The courtroom was packed as Lydia stood once again before a judge, but this time, the atmosphere felt different. The weight of the past few weeks, weeks of struggle, hope, betrayal, and perseverance, had led to this very moment. For the first time in what felt like forever, she wasn't standing alone. Her lawyer, David McAllister, was beside her, and even though the room buzzed with tension, Lydia's resolve was unshakable. She had waited for this day, prayed for it, and now the day had finally come to clear her name. The defendant's seat was empty, but everyone in the courtroom knew exactly who they were all waiting for. Enzo. His absence was a clear indication that something was about to change. He had been arrested and charged with multiple counts related to the crash, charges that went beyond the immediate accident, charges that included conspiracy, manipulation, and even a trail of corruption spanning across years. But Lydia knew that this was only the beginning. David sat beside her, reviewing his notes, his expression unreadable. Lydia felt a quiet confidence emanating from him. He had been by her side throughout the entire ordeal, even when it seemed like the weight of the world was against them. Now, with Enzo facing charges for his role in the cover-up and conspiracy, Lydia felt a flicker of hope. It was a fragile hope, but it was enough to keep her going. The judge, a stern woman with sharp features and an air of no-nonsense authority, stepped into the courtroom, signaling for the session to begin. The gavel came down with a loud, commanding thud, and the room fell silent. Lydia sat up straighter, her hands resting on the table in front of her as the judge addressed the room. Today, we convene for the hearing of the case against Mr. Enzo Corbin. As per the new evidence and recent arrests, the court is now prepared to hear the charges against him. The doors to the courtroom opened, and Enzo was escorted in by a pair of officers. The sight of him in handcuffs, wearing the standard prison jumpsuit, took Lydia's breath away. For so long, Enzo had been the one in control, the one pulling the strings. Now, he was just another man in a courtroom, facing the consequences of his actions. It was a small victory, but it was enough to make her heart beat faster. Enzo's eyes swept across the room, his usual confidence replaced with a trace of uncertainty. When his gaze landed on Lydia, his lips curled into a sneer, but there was no hiding the hint of fear in his eyes. He knew the game was up. His empire of lies was crumbling, and there was nothing left for him to cling to. David stood up, his voice cutting through the tension. Your Honor, we have gathered extensive evidence that not only exonerates my client, Lydia Jones, but also implicates Mr. Enzo Corbin in a scheme to frame her for a crime she did not commit. The evidence we present will show that Mr. Corbin intentionally planted the alcohol in Ms. Jones's vehicle, manipulated witnesses, and orchestrated the entire sequence of events that led to the crash. His actions were deliberate, premeditated, and designed to destroy an innocent woman's life. The courtroom fell into stunned silence. Lydia's pulse raced as David's words sank in. This was it, the truth was finally coming to light. She wasn't the villain in this story. She wasn't the one responsible for the lives lost in that tragic accident. It had always been Enzo, hiding in the shadows, pulling the strings, manipulating the events to fit his narrative. David continued, his voice steady but firm. We have the testimony of Charlie Novak, who has corroborated our claims. Mr. Novak was a former associate of Mr. Corbin, and he has provided us with crucial details that expose the full extent of Corbin's involvement in this conspiracy. We also have forensic evidence that shows Ms. Jones was intoxicated due to the alcohol Mr. Corbin planted in her vehicle. It was never her fault. She was used as a pawn in his elaborate scheme. Lydia's eyes flicked to Enzo, and for the first time, she saw him falter. The facade of confidence that had once made him appear invincible was gone. He had nowhere left to hide. His silence spoke volumes. He knew he was guilty, and he knew that the evidence against him was undeniable. The judge addressed the room. "Mr. Corbin, do you have any response to the charges against you?" Enzo stood, his hands clenched in fists. For a moment, it seemed as though he might lash out, but instead, he simply sneered and spoke with a controlled voice. "This is a farce. I didn't set anyone up. Lydia Jones is guilty, and she knows it. I'm being framed." Lydia's breath caught in her throat at his words. They were the same lies he had fed her for months, the same manipulations that had driven her to despair. But now, they meant nothing. They were just words, empty, meaningless words from a man who had already been exposed for who he truly was. David, calm as ever, stood and addressed the judge. "Your Honor, the truth is clear. Mr. Corbin's lies have been exposed, and the evidence is irrefutable. We ask that you dismiss the charges against Lydia Jones and proceed with the appropriate charges against Mr. Corbin for his role in this crime." The judge nodded thoughtfully, her eyes scanning the evidence before her. It seemed like an eternity before she spoke again, her voice cutting through the air like a sharp blade. "Mr. Corbin," she began, "the evidence against you is overwhelming. You will be held accountable for your actions. You will stand trial for your role in the conspiracy, and the charges against Ms. Jones will be dropped." Lydia's heart soared as the words echoed in her mind. She had waited for this moment for so long, and now, it was finally happening. She was free. The truth had won. But as the judge's gavel came down, signaling the end of the hearing, Lydia couldn't help but glance over at Enzo one last time. His face had turned an unhealthy shade of pale, and his shoulders were slumped in defeat. There was no more power in his gaze, no more manipulation in his words. He was just a man, brought down by his own lies. The days following the trial were a blur. Lydia's name was cleared, and the charges against her were officially dropped. It was a bittersweet victory. While she was no longer facing the death sentence that had hung over her for so long, the scars of the past would remain. The memories of the pain, the betrayal, and the suffering she had endured would never fully fade. But she had something now that no one could take from her: freedom. Clara was waiting for her when she was finally released from the courthouse. The young girl, no longer a helpless child, threw herself into Lydia's arms, tears of joy streaming down her face. "You did it, Mom. You're free." Lydia held her tightly, overwhelmed by the love and relief that flooded through her. "We did it, Clara. We're free." And though the road ahead was still uncertain, Lydia knew that the love of her daughter would carry her through. They had fought together, and together, they had won. As for Enzo, his fate was sealed. He was led away in handcuffs, his once unshakable confidence shattered. Lydia didn't need to see him ever again to know that justice had been served. She had faced the darkness and emerged victorious. This is where the fight ends, but for Lydia, the real journey was just beginning. The road to healing would be long, but with Clara by her side, she knew she had the strength to rebuild her life and create a future worthy of the second chance she had been given.